Most people probably know Bara. She told me not to mention all these awards that she's won, so just know there are plenty of awards. But she's a research fellow at the University of Ljubljana. She's written her own. She's written many things, including her own book, Repetition and Enactment, which is out with Anna Lecter. And she's also a performance artist of huge repute and all sorts of other things, and a fantastic philosopher. That's it. That's all I need to say about you. She's also, as you know, the organizer of this fantastic conference, so thanks to her for that as well. So I'll hand over to you, Bara, for the first part, and then I'll come back for the questions.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Alfie. So my self-controlling machine. Okay, so when you have too much to say and too little time, you start to speak in the form of theses. So I entitled my contribution 11 Theses on Alienation. A reference to you know who is still to be justified. The concept of alienation constantly stings us. It has been put on a pedestal, banned, forgotten, repressed, revived, and questioned again. One thing is sure. Alienation is a master signifier. Master fire, it's cool. It's a master signifier. Let us have this as a thesis 1. Circulating through different discourses throughout the 20th century, it is a master signifier that has perhaps best succeeded in linking East and West. The more the East was getting tired of the idea of alienation, the more the West began to recognize itself in it. This passing, however, is marked with a certain confusion. For some, alienation was considered a barrier to emancipation, while for others, a very path to it. Today, the scraps and fillings of the fallen Iron Curtain make colorful compositions on the wide range between no more alienation and more alienation, please. Or, which is the same, alienation is emancipation. One should dare to put forth a proposition that alienation is not only a master signifier, but that master signifier, the master signifier, running exactly along the seam between East and West of the Northern Hemisphere, ever since the French Revolution, as a thread that both connects and separates the two great economic systems, the two social and libidinal economies, and the two ideas of a social democratic state, socialism and capitalism. The Iron Curtain was the very name of this seam, of this suture. The Berlin Wall, its embodiment. Thesis 2. Alienation seems to be that very wire, a piece of thread that carries within itself the symptoms of this separation, of these two different do-rights, of their fatal misunderstanding and diplomatic ignorance, as well as of the attempts to overcome it. I had it printed here. So. Okay, now, this is what I ran home for, like for the next 3 pages yesterday, and doing this until 3 in the morning. The first thing when I went out was running on the Republic Square, making photo of the inscription below the statue about the Constitution of Yugoslavia and so on. So there are some things that I want to say preliminarily as the main reference points of my line of thought, which I realized yesterday that obviously it would be good to have them quickly explicated. So first, the Lacanian notion of ego-ideal. What is this? Basically, this is the integrated moral law. like Kant's categorical imperative. It largely rests on the unconscious traditional values and beliefs. This moral law is taking the form of a demand. Freud was not quite clear in distinguishing ego ideal and the superego. For Freud, both were connected to the figure of the father, authority, and so on, and both were basically about the hidden rules of what is right and what is wrong, what is accepted and what is prohibited and should be therefore repressed, like the prohibition of incest, for example. Ego ideals are unwritten rules of society and are also the font from where ideology draws. Adrian Johnston, hello. Adrian Johnston had shown beautifully that ego ideal is not a specificity of a singular individual, but is something that is practically inherited. It reproduces itself through generations and changes very, very slowly. Repetition is at work here in its full force. Ego ideal is something that undergoes and forms a certain society, a certain community. And it forms the so-called libidinal economy of a certain society. Okay, this was one thing. The other is the relation between the other and the big other. In Lacan's terms, the divided subject basically means that its relation to the object is always negative. One can grab the object only in the manner that it always misses it. This is the subject's relation to objet petit autre, little a, creating a recurrent roundabout of desire. There's also this image of desire circulating around this object, which is basically like creating a kind of a rupture, void, or whatever. This object of desire can be either another individual or also a real object, like a fetish, for example. But here also comes in the signifying chain. According to Lacan's, this definition, the subject is what a signifier represents for another signifier. It is something that appears within the signifying chain, marked as S2, and this subject appears as S1 within this signifying chain. And these moments of the apparition of the subject within the signifying chain are the moments, that points of the suture, and the meaning to which the subject which appears and disappears in the same moment is connected always comes out in a retroactive manner. I will not go into explanation of these things because I really need to run through. And this signifying chain, S2, creates the realm of knowledge. And it is also the realm of a discourse and the realm of ideology. Ideology works through master signifiers. These are signifiers that become sort of representatives of the big other, l'autre, with big A. And here we come to the level where ego ideal is at work. Now, quickly about the intertwinement of subjects' relations towards the other and the big other. So we all know the subject functions through the desire of the other, and which means that what one desires is connected to what other desires. But it also means that this other is always taking a position of an object of desire. So it's already a double relation. So I desire this person, and within this person, I desire their desire. But this is relation to another object. And then we have to the other. And then we have relation to the big other, which means that the big other, which functions, we saw the realm of knowledge, discourse, of ideology. There is a certain demand at work, demand of this unwritten law and so on. And this demand also operates through certain desire. It's the subject always tries to respond to this desire of the big other, which is something like mystified or something ungraspable. It's always the question: what does he want from me? Like the unconscious. No? Well, so through this, we are like involved into the ideology. So and through this, so we have relations with other people, which are objects of our desire. But this very dialectic is included into this other realm of dialectic, which goes through the big other. So, and the level of ideology of the big other is dealing with identification. Lacan distinguishes, as it is also known, ideal ego from ego ideal. Both are the mechanisms of self-representation. This is how subject sees itself. That is with what it identifies. As ideal ego is one's identification on the level of the self-image, this is ideal ego, explained in Lacan's theory, in the theory of the mirror stage. This we call imaginary identification. So, how one identifies with his bodily image. The other is ego ideal. This is one's identification on the level of the symbolic, so-called symbolic identification. And here we have moral law, values, goals, identification with these things. Okay, another preliminary thing. Okay, Zizek, in one article from the 80s entitled "Pathological Narcissist as a Socially Necessary Form of Subjectivity," talks about the libidinal economy of Yugoslavia in comparison to the libidinal economy of the Western world. He doesn't develop it, though. We'll try to do this. He starts from the critique of American psychology as the psychology of the self, drawing afterwards on the book of Christopher Lasch, The Culture of Narcissism, from 1979. A pathological narcissist is a person who stays on the level of primary narcissism, which is basically the level of a toddler who has not yet entered the stage of object relation. Object relation means growing up, means being capable of love, friendship, comradeship, and so on. Making an object relation means leaving the cocoon of a primary connection to the mother, meeting the father's demand, which is the social demand for integration, and becoming a responsible member of the community. The pathological narcissist is therefore unable to love, partnership, friendship, because he's not capable, he, she, or whatever, is not capable of a symbolic identification. He doesn't have an ego ideal. This means that such a person has no integrated moral law. They might know in principle what is right and what is wrong, but they don't care. Instead of a demand of the father, a pathological narcissist, this is already in Lasch's book, obeys the irrational, capricious demand of the mother. This is the demand of a superego. So we have now the differentiation between superego, which is mother's demand, and ego ideal, which is father's demand. And a bunch of theory, today's theory draws on this. So this is a very important differentiation. And as a pathological narcissist is not able of symbolic identification, this means two things. First, this person is not capable of social integration. He or she or whatever, he only fakes it, but in reality, they don't care. Today, we know it as a palette of antisocial disorders resulting, at the end of the day, in massive shootings in schools, for example. Lasch argues this integration of ego ideal in Western society is the result of the permissive education with no authority or rules whatsoever. So where identifications are at work, also gender identification, all this is on the level of ego ideal, which is always part of the ideology, as I said. And you cannot escape that. So I'm just referring to Helen Stock. Man's gaze, woman's gaze, xenofeminism, transhumanism, whatever you may call it, these are all ideologies. It is on this level that things really are happening. Fantasy, so level of ego ideal, master signifiers and everything. Fantasy is another thing. Fantasy is our modus operandi. It is what makes our life bearable, because being constantly faced with the lack, the abyss, and with meaninglessness of one's existence is simply what makes one insane. Nietzsche knew it well. So phantasmal shields, make it be utopian ideas, idealization of a love object, commodity fetishism, or whatever, is what prevents us from getting crazy. But the problem is, of course, that what drives fantasy is desire. And ideologies, with their triggering desire, also create or conduct fantasies. But the thing is that beyond fantasy, there is no truth to be revealed, as Helen exposed yesterday. So I will not go into the question of truth with Lacan at this point. So one last thing, we need to differentiate the symptoms of a divided subject who is unable of symbolic identification and operates as a toddler with a gun and a nice haircut, and the level of phantasmal shields, which function precisely through symbolic identification. So what are the symptoms? On the one hand, we have the incapability of symbolic identification, which we see today as like antisocial disorders, pathological narcissists, and so on. And the other thing is phantasmal shields through which ideology works, which often works through always works through symbolic identification, while the first one only works through imaginary identification. So those people who are not able of symbolic identification, they put everything into their image, which is, of course, something that it's much more vague and transient, and so that they're out of this majority of identification problem also arises. So this was just these preliminary things. Oh gosh. So back to my talk. In post-war Yugoslavia, in a strong theoretical field whose accessibility to the West was in no way prevented by the Iron Curtain because the borders were open enough, but by the language barrier alone, which still persists alongside the treasure troves of literature untranslated in Western languages. So then, in Yugoslavia, we were literally bombarded with the concept of alienation. Alienation as a master signifier not only prevailed in the official political discourse, but even more so in the discourse of social and political science and philosophy. Even if this might seem weird to the Western view, which sometimes still imagines the Eastern Bloc as a terror of dogmatism, which it was also on one hand, but the discourse about alienation in Yugoslavia was by no means univocal. I'm so thankful, Gregor, where are you, for your exposure of praxis, especially, but also Ljubljana School. So the discussion of, I will just go briefly, like my perspective, the discussion of alienation in Yugoslav philosophical circles, especially by the two branches, the Praxis School and the Ljubljana Lacanian School, was about two different things. Of course, the main officially proclaimed idea of alienation was linked to Marx's idea of alienation. The historical task of a man, which was another prevailing master signifier in the Yugoslav context, was to overcome alienation and therefore reach the goal of full emancipation. This was, alienation, by the way, is also written in the Yugoslavian constitution, and I didn't find it in any other constitution that I checked. Alienation in the constitution and its transgression. So the Praxis school also understood alienation in the Marxist sense. On the one hand, it followed the official line, which was the critique of capitalist exploitation as the very cause of alienation. In the hotspot, there was a self-recognition of the remnants of the bourgeois attitude and appeal to their overcoming. It was like self-critique. On the other hand, Praxis addressed a certain critique towards the official line, which was the critique of the bureaucratized, technocratic socialist power, whose discourse criticizing alienation has become empty and self-referential, and has therefore alienated itself from its own practice, a practice that should strive to transcend alienation. The other alternative idea of alienation was born in the late 1970s in Ljubljana with a return to Hegel through Lacan. They claimed that the idea of a final transgression of alienation is in itself utopian and phantasmal, but that this is, however, positive because alienation is the very constitutive mechanism of a subject, and if somewhere it is through alienation that this subject can also emancipate. For Lacan, alienation and separation are two basic procedures through which the subject is constituted through what Lacan calls the two walls of the impossibility. The subject is always detached from its being. The oneness is always already mythical, a limbic state before the aha effect of self-recognition in the mirror stage. And this aha effect is, of course, this initial constitutive cut that forms the subject as constituted on a leg. So one wall of impossibility of the subject is its connection to its own being. The other wall of the impossibility of the subject is its connection to its own meaning. So whenever the subject appears within the signifying chain, so when the meaning appears, the subject always disintegrates. Both the Praxis school and the Ljubljana school were, in this respect, more or less dissidents. Nadezhda will tell us probably some more about it. However, their understanding of alienation was on the opposing banks. No more alienation for Praxis and more alienation, please, for Ljubljana. Where does this difference between the two ideas of alienation stem from? To detect the origin of their divergence, let us first take a look at what the two ideas have in common. What lies at the core of the idea of alienation is a notion of otherness. Without otherness, there is no alienation. Thesis 3. Thanks Laurent to go into the etymology and so on. So great. What is equally crucial for the idea of alienation is that this otherness is not something in some sort of transcendence. Rather, it is something that intervenes, something that fundamentally determines the one declaring alienation. At the very core of alienation, there is a relation. This relation, however, is not positive in the sense me and you and we make a nice couple. It is not. It does not conjoin the two sides in some sort of a compound. Rather, the relation which lies at the heart of alienation is by necessity negative. It is a relation that exists only and exactly in the manner that it is inexistent, impossible. A definition of alienation would therefore be the following. Alienation is a concept of relation to otherness that is determinant in a negative way of the one declaring it. This would be thesis 4. Alienation is simply another name for the relation between the subject and the object, which is posited as negative. This is Hegel's legacy. Hegel's dialectic is a process of constant repetitive alienation as the mechanism of constitutive negation. From Hegel onwards, alienation is a valid form of thinking the relation between subject and object. Further on, something else can be noticed. The fact that some radical otherness fundamentally determines the one declaring alienation can be taken as constitutive, as for Hegel and Lacan, or as destructive, as for Marx. As for Hegel, alienation is the very path to truth and freedom, the path of emancipation, and for Lacan, it is a constitutive mechanism of the subject. For Marx, alienation is the very process that prevents emancipation. It is clear that it is here, in the tension between Hegel and Marx, that a fundamental confusion about the concept of alienation arises. It all stems from the very turn that Marx formulating following Feuerbach. Thesis 5, so I said it. So I will read Marx's first thesis on Feuerbach. Listen carefully. The main defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the object, der Gegenstand, the object is here named the Gegenstand, something that stands in opposition. So the main problem of the materialism existing so far, including Feuerbach, is that the object, der Gegenstand, actuality, sensuousness, are conceived only in the form of the object, Objekt, or of contemplation, Anschauung, but not as human senses activity, practice, praxis, not subjectively. Hence, it happened that the active side, in opposition to materialism, was developed by idealism, but only abstractly, since, of course, idealism does not know real senses activity as such. I will not comment on it. We can do it later. The chapter on the master-slave dialectic in the phenomenology of spirit shows us the complexity of the relationship between emancipation and alienation. The master-slave dialectic, if we read it carefully, points to all three lines of alienation which Marx's critique took as its starting point. First, the fundamental detachment of humans from the senses thing, which now becomes either a direct object of their work or an indirect object of their enjoyment. Second thing, alienation of a man from their own life in setting it as their privileged object. And third thing, alienation of a man through a man. In all three lines, this alienation also takes the form of emancipation. The slave is liberated by their relation to the senses thing, through work, and enslaved by their relation to life, as in their fear of death, while in the case of the master, it is the other way around. The master is liberated by their relation to life, because they overcame fear of death, and enslaved by their relation to the senses thing through enjoyment. But as master and slave are also the two extremes of one single self-consciousness for Hegel, we can say not only that what liberates one by necessity enslaves the other, but also that every experience of alienation is at the same time the experience of emancipation. And what is equally striking, every experience of emancipation is always already the experience of alienation. But through the master-slave dialectic, But although the master-slave dialectic is the common reference point for the debates on alienation, it is the chapter on the state of legality in the phenomenology of spirit that encloses the logic of alienation, which strikes the spirit itself, and is in this sense more radical. Here it becomes clear that there is nothing on the other side. Humans as such as are essentially alienated. There is no fundament or origin to return to, but it is the very alienation, and this is Hegel's main point, that forms the ever-developing and ever-sublating essence of a man, an essence of a substance that is the subject. Not going into the complexity of the Hegel-Marx relation, let us put forth two things here. First, we can see that in the notion of alienation, the definition of content, of meaning, of something that is alien, strange, or unfamiliar, intertwines with a formal determination of something that is simply on the other side. The first one is that of content, of meaning, of the signified. This would be Marx's definition. The second one is that of form, of structure, of a signifying position. This would be Hegel's or Lacan's. It was already clear to Hegel that the two cannot be separated. Of course, the content is a form, the form is a content. Lacan soon came up with the conclusion that the signified always already passes into the signifier, which is itself a porous entity, producing meanings all along or in along. In Hegel, there are actually two different principles of alienation, Entfremdung and Entäußerung, which could be interpreted exactly in the way of talking the same thing from the perspective of form and from the perspective of content. That which is alienated, Entfremden, from the subject, its object, is the result of the subject's having entäußert itself, externalized itself. Entäußerung could be also named some sort of internal externalization, which is the equivalent of Lacan's extimacy as external internalization. That which is most internal is already external. What is external is our greatest interiority. Second, we can also say that there are two basic definitions of alienation as a concept, ontological and socio-historical. Thesis 6. They could also be called idealist / structuralist and materialist / practical. The same master signifier, alienation, is therefore a bearer of two different concepts. Thesis 7. The ontological definition states that being and non-being are always already coextensive, that otherness is contained in the one, and that the object, as its inner otherness, is always already contained in the subject. Alienation is therefore the only possible mode of the subject, and it is only through alienation that the subject can also emancipate itself. The second one, the socio-historical, speaks of something quite different. It speaks of the fact that man, the individual, can only attain self-sufficiency by being inseparably bound up with his object, her, whatever's object, which is their life, nature, the earth, the product of their work, and so on. Their self-sufficiency on a purely experiential level is the condition of their emancipation, which can only enable them to be self-sufficient and self-developing on the level of thought, which is Hegel's perspective. So these are two different concepts, and the very fact that they both bear the same name has made possible their conceptual overlap throughout the 20th century, with what I began, as well as their clashes and misunderstandings. But it has also given rise to a new conceptual field, Thesis 8. However, and here is the key, this connection can and must stay dialectical. Alienation is emancipation precisely insofar as it arises from the constant recurrent demand to transcend it. Praxis and the Ljubljana School, more alienation please and no more alienation, east and west, all goes on. But I have not finished yet. So thesis 9, alienation is the only convenient way of conceptualizing the relation between the subject and the object in our complex reality. In our world, in our minds, in our speech, and in our physical reality, things are intertwined. They operate through the constant shifts between oppositions and conjunctions. Opposition, however, is interconnection. Alienation not only describes or conceptualizes reality. Alienation is reality, thesis 10. Reality as such operates through alienation. The question is, of course, what reality? We are used to speaking about subjective and objective reality. Again, an opposition. What we are at the threshold of right now, I suppose, is that very parallax between the two realities, that we, as human beings, we are able to take both positions at once, to grasp them in one single scope, in one single blink of the eye, in one single thought. This is what I called somewhere the era of instantaneity. There are, I believe, two great, for me, philosophical enterprises that were trying to take both positions at once, that of a subject and that of an object, Hegel's and Deleuze's. One brought alienation to its concept, turning a negation into a positive principle. The other took the greatest effort to expel negation, to think of differentiation and of the intertwinement of everything there is without the conceptual tool of alienation. Who was right? Well, today there is a great opposition between Deleuzian and Hegelian scholars. But there was also psychoanalysis. Without making a philosophical system out of it, it grasped alienation in an inverted line. What is this reality, this world? For Lacan, reality is phantasmatic, it is a representation, a semblance, a symbolic and imaginary construct. At the same time, of course, there is the real, a certain ungraspable, unsymbolizable reality that we stumble across, that hits us unprepared in the moment of surprise, or directly invades the unconscious before the consciousness manages to build its representation of the world around it, along with its image of the self as the one observing the world. Something like the reality of the fire in the room where the child was sleeping while the father was dreaming. Don't you see, father, that I'm burning? Even if reality is phantasmal, the world exists for Lacan. Life is not just a dream, and psychoanalysis is not idealism. And this world, when it is all in flames, like the National Theatre in the occupied Sarajevo during the Balkan War, or when the beautiful leafy villages burn in the film by Kusturica, whose name must not be mentioned, or when Morocco or Mariupol or Beirut burns, this reality is not only some shared representation of the world, not for those who are in the flames, who feel the heat and smell of the smoke. What is this? As Alenka said last time, I'm maybe interpreting this wrongly, but I found it really inspiring. The one on the couch is actually the world. And we could go into this Freud's traumatic neurosis after the First World War, but yeah, later maybe. Existentialism, existentialism has long been forbidden to talk about. In the moment when the world, a representation of the world, existential experience is the moment when the world, our representation of the world, disappears. When it is no longer valid, no longer possible. When the world disappears, there is no room for worldly pains. There is not even room for psychoanalysis, as in this very moment, there is no alienation. Thesis 11. If this experience happens to be a common experience or a collective experience, a shock of reality that strikes a community, it can act as a certain form of catharsis, a total reset. Is alienation a helpful concept today? Sure. I will skip something. Of course, we can speak in terms of crisis, because this is one last thing I really want to say. But crisis is not just another name for the fact that crisis is just another name for the fact that circumstances have changed and that we are unable to adapt to them. It is, at the end of the day, a question of a habit, of normality. The so-called crisis of the Middle Ages took 3 centuries. A crisis of the colonial West has been going on for 50 years now. Today, identity crisis in East and West, alienation is at hand. For some, the endless choice of identities seemed liberating, even emancipatory, but it ended up being frustrating and paralyzing. With identification, it is just like with other products. If we take it as something at our disposal, an object of our consumers' freedom of choice. It is like standing in front of the fridge of yogurts. We will never manage to decide on the right one. As a response to this, we now have a common reaction. Oh, fine, we are all alienated anyway. We do not know who we are everyone, and no one. We are the crisis. Seems elevating. When identity crisis becomes a constitutive moment of identity itself, things become self-perpetuating. Setting the very problem as a solution, that is justification of the status quo. Enjoyment of a poor, immature narcissist playing a victim role. In this age of self, pathological narcissism and so on, we must distinguish 2 sides of the same problem. 2 sides of a demand for recognition. This, I think, for me, it was revelation when I So I surprised myself by this. And I haven't seen anyone pointing this out yet, but I really find it important. So what we know as the phenomenon of the identity crisis has two sides. Recognition of one's identity is the flip side of another recognition, which is much more basic, a simple recognition of someone's existence. Hegel's dialectic of master and slave points exactly to this. Remember that self-consciousness here is dealing with two objects, life and a sensuous thing. So, first side, we call it identity crisis. From the big other, from the society, one demands the answer to the question, who am I? If there is no answer, if the big other is mute, we get identity crisis. In an eager search for the disintegrated ego ideal, a crisis is all over the place. Symptomatic craving for gender identity, which is getting nuts in the USA with puberty-blocking drugs and so on, or for mental health identity, that meaning personalized disorder, which is gaining popularity recently, and which the two of them have outpaced the old school identities like a position in a family, profession, and so on. It is all about the grown-ups not giving recognition to the kids. In the name of offering them freedom and generous support for their rights, the Western or even global society has resigned from the position of the one who is able to offer recognition. If one cannot offer, one cannot gain recognition, as this is a mutual process, so we get a vicious circle. And then we have this side too. We can call it a crisis of existence. One demands an answer to a different question. Do I exist? Am I? To be recognized as someone, one needs to be confirmed in their bare existence. And the other way around, the very recognition of one's existence is already a recognition of one's identity. The symptom of the identity crisis is a fluctuation of abnormal identities, which are, as we can observe, descending more and more to the bare existential side: gender identity, bodily image, mental health identity, and so on. The symptom of the crisis of existence is the outbursts of individual experiences of unlinked narratives demanding a connection to the field of identification. The other, who is supposed to know, that is, analyst, as the representative of the ego ideal, the representative of the ego ideal, which is shrinking like Alice in Wonderland, need to respond to these two demands in their daily service. On the basis of personal experience shared with them, they need to provide interpretation, offering some master signifiers as those fake guarantees that the big other is still watching them, and by listening to them over and over again, they need to reaffirm their bare existence by the sole act of listening. Not to be too pessimist, there is a rehabilitation program possible. There are two There are two fundamental social contracts of a democratic society, which means government of all. One is putting the community as a starting point, and the other is putting the individual. The first is the idea, this is a metaphor. So we have these two basic social contracts. One is the idea of fisherman's net. You pull one knot in the net, and the net doesn't work. All the fish run away. The other is the idea of colorful tags, individual units which are making different patterns. In the first, the net depends on each individual. The individual is worthy and irreplaceable as a member of the community. In the second, individuals can take different colors and make all different patterns, but if one is lacking, this doesn't affect the community. He's free to leave, but if he leaves, nobody will notice. Identity crisis is a crisis of recognition. In the first, the fisherman's net, recognition is automatic almost and structural. It functions through an individual's irreplaceable role in the society, and therefore through his or her or whatever's responsibilities. In the second, recognition needs to be deserved and fought for. It all depends on how eagerly one fights for his rights or her let us not identify with our right to identify with crisis. Perhaps one should look at the ego ideal of the society of the fisherman's net for some hints. Okay, now I will just go to the end. So I was studying constitutions until 3 in the morning. So to sum up, so all the European constitutions, of course, are based on the Declaration of Rights of the Citizen of Man, like the document of the French Revolution. The American one is a different story. The American Constitution, which is the oldest constitution in the world, also from 1970-89, but I feel really this should concern us, like having a constitution from then, like, without any changes, but whatever. So the Western constitutions, what you find in them are rights, individual rights and freedoms. In the Eastern constitutions, okay, I checked Yugoslavian and Russian, you have more or less responsibilities. Also with all the basic human rights and all the basic freedoms included, both the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, everything is also, like equally as in the German or French, put in the Yugoslav revolution. But Yugoslav revolution in every second, revolution, yes, constitution, every second sentence is responsibility of the other towards the community, solidarity, keeping human dignity on a certain level, and absolute, what is absolutely forbidden is any kind of exploitation of man by man. So, last sentences, duties, responsibilities, and accordingly also rights. The net holds together the idea of human dignity, brotherhood, solidarity. I was going to call this late lecture in one point Alienation. Actually, no, this just came out of a joke with Nathan, but later on I thought maybe Yugoslavian is really alien nation. Something dealing with a broken pioneer oath and so on. You know, philosophers have only interpreted the world so far. It is time to change it.
Great. I mean, I have loads of comments and thoughts. I'm already thinking, how to publish it. You took on an enormous amount there. It was an incredible talk. Maybe I'll quickly go first, then I'll come around. And I guess I just wanted to, well, first of all, you started by talking about, on the one hand, individuals who struggle in this particular world. You were talking very interestingly about those who can't symbolically identify. And on the other hand, you were talking about the bigger social picture, the libidinal economy of this current society, as you call it, and then via Lash, what you were talking about as the disintegration of ego ideal. And then this kind of internal-external thing develops really interesting, I think, in the 10th theses, with this interesting, it's the world that's on the couch, like the internal is the external and so on, which is from Alenka. Yeah. And I guess then you're sort of saying that, and then you finished, I thought, with what I thought was an extremely powerful point about the parents not giving recognition to the children. Is that how you put it? And it seems to me this is what I wanted to pick up on. We were talking about it the other night, the question of Marxism and puberty or whatever, and this kind of generation who can't grow up in a way. And so I guess, my question is what is driving this collapse of the ego ideal, which leads to a society where the tragedy of this next generation is that they can't go through puberty, they can't get recognition from the adults, they can't become, and this you sort of chart this sort of change, but my question is, what is driving in your mind this decline of the ego ideal that causes this sort of
what is the cause
problem?
I think it's the same cause on the West and on the East. It was some kind of rebellion, common rebellion, also punk is very important here, against the classical authorities, the hierarchical structures. And it was going on all levels, within the ideology, critique, theory, philosophy, and especially also education. And I think Lash is totally right. Education is like basic thing. So it's the process of how you grow up, like the new generation, is the cause. Is the cause. It is surely it is this permissive education that combined, and this is the second cause, combined with money. So we see it clearly here because we have the opportunity to experience both systems. Nobody in our schools, nobody, of course, dared to question the authority of the teacher. Probably it was the same on the West. But once, we always had these collective actions, for example, picking up trash together or cleaning the school environment. But then my mother told me everything began when one parent came and he said, my son will not be trash, how you call this guy? Trash collector. And he had it's all about, money is power, and it goes through the discourse of rights with no responsibilities.
No, I think that's great. And anyway, I don't want to take up too much. I can see already hands. So yeah, let's go. I can see already 4 or 5. So I'll come. I'll start with Nicholas. I think you go first. Oh, shall I pass you the mic and collect it? Yeah.
Thanks, Bara. I have one question and then one comment. The question is very maybe simple, and it has to do. You made this distinction, which I think is a correct distinction, but I think it was a little bit unclear how you thought. So the distinction where you search for identity, or let's say social recognition, as determined by certain ways in which the subject is determined through, let's say, determinate signifiers. So you're this or that type of person. So you get social recognition. And then on the other hand was the existence. So recognition as of your existence as such. Now I want to just, I think, so on the one hand you said that when the big brother, big other stays silent, then you get a kind of a, let's say, hysteric economy of recognition. But so that I think you can. There's things in which the big other, as a society, can somehow manage. But I wonder, how do you think about in terms of existence as such? I mean, that term that's a function that that someone can feel. And my suggestion would, or question here maybe, is that there's two ways of thinking why it cannot be filled by the big other. The one is because somehow it's impossible, or the other one because you don't need to feel it, because it's already implied in everything. So this would be, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Nicholas. Yeah, one thing I would say first for the identification on the level of identity. Who am I? I wouldn't say this is sort of determination. It all works like not from the outside. It's an internal thing. You flow in between. You don't know what the other desires and so on. And this entire package has these two options of imaginary and symbolic identification. This would be the first. So this existence is something that I really this is the risky part, because I never thought about so directly before, but it's connected for me to the bare line between life and death, between being and non-being. Sorry, and it's just this line where, for Lacan, you get to this point of oneness of, like, when you're the one with being, it means that you are not yet, or not anymore, capable of identification on a level of symbolic or imaginary. This means that you're either only yet born and still in this limbic state with no self-recognition, even the unconscious signifier has not yet interrupted. But on the other hand, of course, after that. So I think this experience is something, this existential experience, to be true, is like experience of death.
Great, okay, yeah, you go, Laurent, and I'll pass the mic down here.
But you should survive it in order to experience.
Thank you very much, Bara, for this tour de force presentation. I particularly loved the fact that the way you describe alienation resembles as something like a virus. You know, it's some kind of viral dimension with the concept circulating from one side to the other and changing and morphing. And this is something which I found very, very exciting. I just wanted to add to what you said, perhaps something that could add, let's say, to your argument, which is the fact that in this kind of dance that alienation has with emancipation, the side of emancipation also is more complex than what we think, because again, as we know, I'm sorry to bring back my old friends, the Romans again, but emancipation is the process by which, historically, let's say, someone who is an alieni iuris under the patria potestas of the father suddenly is emancipated by the father. So the emancipation is done through emancipation. That is through the selling of a good, which is the child that you want to emancipate, that you have to sell 3 times, to emancipate 3 times, so that he becomes, or she becomes, but the Romans is always a he, free. So it means that emancipation, when you emancipate yourself, actually it's the other in yourself that emancipates you, so to speak, meaning that you're not alone in your process of emancipation. It's not kind of self-construction, but it's, let's say, a transformation of you yourself into a good that you're selling to yourself, something like that. So even emancipation itself, the process of emancipation, is a process of alienation also in this sense.
Sure, I totally agree. Thank you, Laurent, for this. I think they both condition each other and prevent each other to come true. So it's both. And yeah, definitely more work on emancipation. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I've got a mic here. Should I go? But I thought that was amazing. So many things to talk about, and I have like a gazillion questions, but I don't want to take up all your time. We could chat forever. But I did. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about like social media, because I know that's one of the books you're thinking about, and how that relates to recognition and the impossibility of recognition, or trying to find recognition in a place that won't give it, and maybe this like sustains and generates narcissism. But I wanted to talk about like this pathological narcissism, and something that I've just noticed in an anecdotal way, that like often you see Lucanians kind of identifying with their structure in a way that's almost like as you would with astrology, you know, like you predict, I'm a perverse person and therefore I act in this way and I have no choice, and we talked about sexuation the other day, but obviously, you know, we're talking about this pathological narcissism and the inability to participate in public life, but then and then this question of, well, you're structured in such a way and you have no choice and this is my desire or whatever, but then how do we sort of transform that, and is there a possibility to transform that into something more neurotic or analysed in the analyst discourse? Because in a sense, you know, there's already this saying, identifying yourself as, say, I am a perverse person who, or even this like young person who says, I am autistic, or I am this, already there's that distance there that could be productive, right?
Thank you, Helen. I think this is a really important question. So first of all, I think that as we had at one point in the 70s, 80s, and still we have it now, the so-called psychology of the self, psychotherapy and so on, that true psychoanalysis was criticizing. So, sorry, to be clear. So let's simplify things. Let's say that for 30 years, from 70s till 2000, there was prevailing discourse of the psychology of the self, for example, in the United States and maybe Britain. And psychoanalysis, especially the Ljubljana school, was criticizing this psychology of the self. It was kind of subversive. But what is the phenomenon right now? Because of the popularity of Ljubljana school, which is great, which is super important, but it has also become a popular discourse, and people are like really taking it. It's almost like an ideology also. People are taking it like very simplified. They identify with whatever, with narcissism, with all different, whatever you get out of this discourse, you can identify with. So, and that's why I think it's really important question. How can we, so the role of the analyst, who is the other who is supposed to know, so how will, and it's on this position, I totally agree with you, it's on this position, the task, or only this position has the capability of bringing this to a certain different level. So, and also, I don't know, say restructuring, helping, whatever, giving some effect on how the ego ideal can be produced. Because what I hope it was coming through this talk is that ego ideal is something that is like very plastic. No, it's something that can be like plastilene. It can be worked on. It can be transformed. But I didn't answer. But we'll do it later.
Okay, yeah, I think we've got time for a couple more. So have Ross and then over here. So you go ahead.
Thank you very much for that.
I have a very short remark. You know that in the culture of narcissism, there is talk about alienation, but in a very specific context, and that's important for the usual conventional anti-alienation talk in the Yugoslav society. There is talk about alienation only in connection with consumption, about settling into the alienated state. You can't go out of it, and then the appeal to consume and to construct a consumer identity, and this kind of the very talk about consumer society, consumer identity, anti-consumer society. That's that's part of the anti-alienation talk you started with.
Yeah, thank you, Nadežda. Thank you for this comment. Looking forward to your lecture tonight.
Okay, sorry, Ross, you go ahead and then.
Thank you. So my question was about the permissiveness of education, or permissive education, and which you drew, as I understood it, from Christopher Lasch. And I'm just wondering a little bit about the historical context for that conception of permissive education and whether it really describes the way in which we might think of education now. So I suppose I'm coming here from the British context, where schools are often run, so the kind of celebrity head teacher, Camilla Burble-Singh in the United Kingdom at the moment, who's addressed the Conservative Party conference, basically runs schools as if they're a kind of concentration camp. And this is an incredibly popular way of disciplining children today. One might also think of the permissiveness or otherwise of higher education. Now, on the one hand, there's a lot of discussion about the sorts of belligerence of students and the kind of complaint culture and so on. But also the withdrawal of funding for university education kind of complicates very much the idea that it's a permissive environment in any sense whatsoever. I suppose my question tends to want to ask whether growing up isn't actually overrated in many ways.
Yeah,
there's Greta
definitely.
Thunberg here, perhaps.
Yeah.
So also, if you think about the kind of the educational context of the school strike specifically, which is, well, at school we learn that we are tending towards an apocalyptic future, and yet what we're taught has no consequence whatsoever on how the world is actually run. So A, why bother going to school, because what you teach us actually has no effect, and B, we have no future. So so I'm just wondering whether it may have seemed that education was permissive in the 70s and so on when Lasch is writing, but now are we in a kind of educationally permissive culture?
Yes, I think still. But
I'd like you to kind of say why you think that, because I don't think we are.
Yeah. So for me, what is permissive culture is it's structural. It's like I can say from personal experience now. So of course, you know, you had Jasper Sewell and this retro effect, reaction to the ideas of permissive education, and Jasper Sewell says you need to learn yourself. You need to know how to say no to your kids. No, so this is what I think like people are now practicing, like really trying to say no to the kids, to set the limits, because the limits is what the kids need. No, so I think the permissive education is still going on very largely on a larger scale. So I know many parents who are just not able to say no to their kids at any point. So it's a struggle and it's work to educate your kids in this society with limitations. It's a true struggle and true work. So this is my personal experience. But I can understand this. So, but I also said before, and I also think still that this holds. So one is permissive education, the other is money, like running the world around, turning the world around. No? And then of course you have the flashback, the boomerang effect is the, as you said, I didn't know about this really strict classical or Christian or whatever schools that are trying, you know, to go through a really disciplined thing. But I think these are the two sides of the same coin, and yeah, it's just a boomerang effect. But yeah,
it's a backlash.
It's a backlash, but we can really talk about it also later. No?
Yeah,
it's very important, I think, and just like.
I agree. Anecdotally, my daughter's in school in the UK, and it really rings true. It's so interesting. But anyway, I know we're run over somewhat, but we all have more to talk about. So we'll do that later over drinks and so on and so on. But let's thank Bara once again for a fantastic talk, and thank you so much.